Good afternoon and welcome to Conversations on Showing Up for Kids. My name's Tim Markle. I'm director of the Southern Regional Center for Children and Youth with Special Healthcare Needs. We are out of the Waisman Center in the fantastic town of Madison. Conversations on Showing Up for Kids is, as you can tell, a casual type space where we get to learn more about disabilities. We get to learn more about research. We get to learn more about benefits. We just try to mine the depths of what's out there to help families and our champions that support our families. And so today we are going to be talking to Dr. Brittany Travers, which is probably the only time I've ever used Dr. Brittany Travers because she's Brittany. Just so you know how this conversation is going to go. I've known Brittany for a while now and just really enjoy learning about her research. Well, Dr. Travers moves around the world of autism spectrum disorder and motor function. But we want to know more about Brittany. We want to get to know a little bit more besides, the graphs and the charts. So we're hoping to learn a little bit more about why she got involved in research, why she continues research, because I know it's not easy, what maybe some of her interests are. And then we're going to talk about this whole motor function. Why does moving even matter? So we'll come back to that, but Brittany, welcome. Glad that you're here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tim. I'm really excited to be here.
So what are you currently researching? What are you working on?
Yeah, so I think very broadly, I like to think about our research as thinking about movement, right? So human movement and how dynamic and spectacular and awe-inspiring movement can be. So we focus a lot on looking at movement and then kind of corresponding motor skills, which I think is, maybe kind of like, it makes it sound a little less fun than like movement in general.
Well, when you say motor skills, I think about working on my car, which I am not good at. And so you say motor skills and I get really scared. You're going to ask me to change the oil.
I know, it's kind of amazing how we think about movement and you think about ballet and you think about, all these things that we can do with our bodies and how amazing that is. And then sometimes when you think about like motor skills, it's like, oh, so I walk across the street.
Exactly. And I love, because I have some kids. And so we always grew up with, okay, well, how's their fine motor skills? Like they were really something special. And then what are their gross motor skills? What are those things that make you want to throw up? And it took me a while that's not what gross motor skills mean. It's not those skills that make you
just got that. Oh my gosh, I love that so much. I know, it's very clear that nobody in marketing ever was talking about these motor skills. Right. Like, let's just put gross in front of something.
Your kid needs to improve their gross motor skills. No, thank you. I don't think he does.
We're fine here.
Fine. Spits up Army every day. He's fine. No problem with his gross motor skills.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
Just a little bit. What are our motor skills? When you talk about motor skills, what are you talking about?
Well, it's a huge category of things, right? So it's everything from, dunking a basketball to being able to move my eyes around, right? Or speech as a motor skill as well. So it's one of those things where it's sometimes really hard to pin down. So I guess in some ways I've carved out a niche for myself that's very broad. So there will never be a dull moment. But at the same time, when people ask, what are motor skills? And in our work, we focus a lot on motor skills in both autistic and non-autistic individuals. And people oftentimes ask me, well, how are motor skills different? And why does that even matter? So we have tried to tackle both of those questions. On one hand, for me, movement is so awe-inspiring that there's a piece of me that's like, well, like,
yeah, I don't know why I don't fall down more. I really do not understand how sometimes I am able to get from point A to point B when I'm stumbling and bumbling. It's like, this is just amazing. I'm still upright.
It's amazing. And I was at a talk Friday at the Wiley Center, and it was a person who studies infant motor development. And she was saying that parents on average say that their kids fall down 1 or 2 times, like when they're first walking, 1 or 2 times a week. But when she brought them into the lab, she found that the kids fell down about 39 times in a span of an hour.
Oh my God.
And they just get back up and do it again. And I actually told my daughter that she was trying to ride her bike. She's 3 and she was feeling a little nervous. And I was like, well, babies fall down 39 times an hour. We're going to pad you up here and we're going to send you. But like for whatever reason, that gives me a little bit more courage in this world and thinking about that.
And does that whole, the repetition of our muscles trying to do something and then it not working, and so then we try it again, maybe engage them in a slightly different way without ever sitting there going, okay, I am now going to concentrate on my shoulder more. I don't think about that. I don't think about it as I'm walking down the hall, okay, I'm gonna have my feet a little bit flatter. But I adjust to the terrain. I adjust to if I fell down here. And
Yes.
and I'm doing that without thinking. I mean, that's just,
isn't that amazing? It's incredible. Well, and think about this too, Tim. You wear snow pants and think about all that creates, right? It's the different clothes, it's the different terrain, it's, ice, it's sand, there's different textures. There's so many things when it comes to walking, and the fact that we as human beings do so many motorized, even just eye movements, right? And how directed those can be. So there are some scientists who suggest that our human brain was developed for the sole purpose of moving and interacting with the world around us. And I think what's really neat about that is, first of all, it establishes this link between the brain and movement. But what's also, so some of the data that they use is there's actually a type of sea creature, and I wish I knew more about the ocean, but I don't. So I'll tell you it's a sea creature, knowing that that's also a broad category of things. But it actually, in its youth, moves around and it has a brain. And then when it plants itself on coral, it eats its own brain and it never journeys forth again. And so this notion of our brain for movement and how we take in information about all the different things in the world around us, and then we act on it by moving our eyes or our mouth or our hands, or, across the lifespan, we have different, across individuals, we have different things that our bodies can afford us to do. But we're moving, and I think that it's awe-inspiring. And I like to think too that our movement patterns may almost be like fingerprints for us.
oh, so
And
that
thinking,
I move in my own, we all have general, like for those of us who use our legs for mobility, we
yes,
would say that we walk, and maybe at some point we run. But you're saying that nobody walks the same, nobody runs the same, is that there's unique differences with all of our
there
movement?
seems to be unique differences with all of our movements. And how amazing is that? And I don't know if you've ever had this experience where you've seen somebody out of the corner of their eye move, and there's like a recognition there. And the idea too is that even for people who don't, use their legs for mobility, eye patterns and movements like that are also going to potentially be their own specific signature. And again, we don't think about these things. And actually, when we do start thinking about some of these things, like think about like athletes who might be in a slump and they start really thinking about what it is they're doing that might be
My whole
different.
childhood, I was in an athletic home. That describes me in athletics. Thank you so much. So, yeah.
Well, I've had this experience where I start
15-year slump. That's all it was.
I love that. But it's amazing because we begin to think about like, oh, how do I walk, right? And then it changes. It totally shifts things and how we're thinking about it.
So that makes a lot of sense more now that you explained that, about why you are also looking at autistic brains and brains that are maybe wired different, and we don't understand why, and we don't really understand exactly how, but we just know that there's what we've decided is a realm of normality, which now we're starting to see maybe we have been way too constricted.
Oh yeah.
What a brain looks like. And I've seen a lot of brain scans over, different presentations. I've never seen one, and I've never seen them alike. I've never seen a normal brain. It just doesn't,
exactly.
they're all different. And so trying to link those neuro differences with the motor movement? Is that sort of what you're looking at?
Yes, that's exactly what we're looking at. So how, like, what can motor and movement tell us about the brain of individuals and, of individuals, right? So each one of us, but then also think about neurodiversity in some of these diagnostic categories as well. And then on the flip side, what our lab also does is, do motor skills matter? Like, does it actually matter that we're different? And in which cases might it matter? Right. And so thinking about, like, are there daily living skills that are less or more accessible based on a person's motor skills? And we are finding in our work that motor skills, so we measure things like finger tapping speed and, grip strength. So really like fundamental, not the most exciting movement types of things, right? But we do find that those are related to daily living skills. Only to a point, though. You don't have to be this all-star athlete to, do your grocery shopping. And our environments like support us in these ways too. So it's not just about like trying to change the motor skills of a person. It's really thinking about the person, what they bring to the table and their individual skills and the environments. And yeah, so I guess like the big picture goal of my work is I hope that all of us can really appreciate the different ways that we move and what it says about the amazing diversity of our brains.
So did this geeking out over movement, did it like, junior high, high school, was it in grad school? How did you get involved in wanting to be, obviously got fascinated in movement and then you're like, I want to study this. This is something I want to do. How did that happen?
You asked such good questions. So I think when I think about it, it really does go back to my childhood. My parents are both, they're retired now, but they were both podiatrists, which is a very unique upbringing. And the number one question that I got as a child, really for many, many, many years was, are you going to be a podiatrist? And the answer was always clearly.
Is podiatry, is it an inherited gene? Or?
Yeah, it turns out it's recessive if it's.
Oh, yeah, yeah, okay, recessive.
So growing up, my sister and my mom loved shopping and I was not a fan, and nor was my dad. And so what my dad and I would do is sit outside of stores like at the mall and watch people walk. And he would tell me about different gait patterns.
No way.
Yeah. And it was just one of those
people watching to a scientific level.
Well, it got me so interested in seeing just differences. And, we're all moving about, but how, look at these differences. And so I also was just very interested in the brain, and this is actually due to a long family history of Alzheimer's. So my grandma and my grandpa both had Alzheimer's. Every person, every sibling, and also my grandma's parents had Alzheimer's, and she was oftentimes the primary caretaker for her siblings, and then she herself got it. And we as a family have just this family history of Alzheimer's and caring for people who develop Alzheimer's. And so that was my adolescence in thinking about just the brain and how do we learn new things. So I went to graduate school and got to study at the University of Alabama under Mark and Laura Klinger. And they were really interested in learning in autistic individuals and just how does learning occur? And that I was like, yes, let's, right? This is amazing. But so many of the learning tasks were motor based. And, like learning a certain motor sequence with your fingers on a keyboard and things like that. And we kept finding that motor learning was the same in the groups, which is awesome, but doesn't really make a great career. But
we found everything's the same.
Yeah.
All right, I'm done. I'm going to retire now.
All right.
Very much. Yeah,
exactly.
Not much of a career in that.
But I guess part of it too is that as I was learning, the ADOS, which is one of the behavioral autism assessments and observation scales, I was being taught, like focus on these things like bids for social communication, eye contact, but I couldn't stop looking at movement. It was just one of those things where I guess maybe call it serendipitous distraction, but I just kept finding that my eye kept moving towards movement and how people were moving and how that looked similar or different. And so, that's really what kind of launched my interest in that. So I will say that one of the biggest questions I get is where in the body and how does movement differ in general in autistic individuals? So hopefully I've already set the stage that, all of us are moving different. And how amazing is that? Yeah, and there's no like normal tree in the world. There's no normal flower, right? Like, so there's, I think, as you said before, like, let's avoid putting value labels on these differences in movement as much as we can. I do find that I'm constantly trying to extract out and weed out ableism from the ways that we think about things.
We are well steeped in it. We are steeped and we have been seeped. And we have been marinated in ableism since probably the beginning of time. And so it's not going to be an easy thing to divest from.
Yes, but we're trying, and that's, we'll make mistakes, I'm sure, but we're trying to move in that direction. But we wanted to think about, okay, so we have these movement patterns, we had joint patterns of people doing different tasks. And we had about 4,000 files of these, like Excel files. And for each file, it had an X, Y, and Z coordinate for every joint position that we had. We had 16 different joints. So like the head, the neck, the shoulders, the hands, the feet, and we had balance profiles because they were standing on a wee balance board while doing this task. And we had it every 6 milliseconds. So imagine like, and that was, right? So
is there anybody else in the world who would be smiling and excited about this gajillion point Excel spreadsheet data set?
Maybe not, but I will say I wouldn't be smiling today if I really had stumbled upon some amazing computer science collaborators. And I was like, I have a big data problem.
That's huge. I mean, that's so many data points.
It was really almost intimidating. But what we were able to do is just say, okay, let's feed it into this computer model where it's looking at all of this information. And from this information, are we able to predict whether the person from whom these data points came from is likely to have an autism diagnosis or not? And these were children and adolescents. And what we found was that we were about 85% accurate in being able to distinguish between the two diagnostic groups. And then our next question was, okay, where in the body? Because I always get this, like is it here? Like
only they had a better left elbow. That's, I think, it's all, right here.
Exactly. And I think that, it seems so obvious now, in retrospect, which I've heard is actually the mark of a good research finding. It's like,
if what you find makes sense, this is
I guess we should have really known that before. But what we found was that it was really across the entire body that these movement differences were present. And a lot of it was in in balance. And so, so just thinking about, motor and movement differences being, something that's a whole body type of phenomenon.
Oh, and you haven't even touched on this. Is just because of, my rapidly speeding age, is I can't help but think how that also is important in the world of aging and in falls and imbalance and learning how our body movements change as we age and what we need to do to keep moving in a healthy way.
Yes, no, thank you for bringing that up, Tim, because it's one of those things where there's some data, not from our lab, but from another group that really showed that, all of us, as we get older, our balance declines. It just is what it is. It's a very complicated system. We did a review paper looking, this was outside. I actually don't even think there was any papers of people with autism, but we were looking at stroke across like ADHD, basically anybody who had ever studied balance in the brain and like what areas of the brain are involved. And guess what? It's everywhere. It is a full brain phenomenon, as we might think. So often we think like, oh, the cerebellum, right? Like sometimes that's what we're taught or that we teach. But it really is like, if there are things like we have to take in visual information and we're taking in vestibular information, and all of these are different parts of the brain. Those all need to be connected in a way that then allows us to make these like incremental adjustments all the time. So it's like the sensation, the linking, the motor output. If you have any disruptions across any of those areas, then it's going to likely lead to some balance challenges. And that's why like all of us are likely, if we're, lucky enough to live that long, we're going to be experiencing some of those challenges. And then in autistic individuals, we actually do find that, especially in adolescence, so in childhood, the balance differences are not really there. But in adolescence, there's this atypically early plateau that seems to happen in the balance of autistic adolescents, where the non-autistic group just keeps kind of climbing, and they have that plateau a little bit later. Okay. So thinking, we don't have the data downstream, but thinking about what that might mean for aging.
Okay, so you used $1 million word there, vestibular. What's vestibular?
Yes, thank you so much for saying that. So it is a sense unto itself that tells us if we are upright and how we are relative to gravity. So very often our vestibular system will take information from like our ear canals and think about where the fluid is in the ear canals, and that can kind of tell us where we are in space. And we do think that's a little bit different than proprioception, because proprioception tells us like, oh, our foot is on here, or, this is where I think my body is in space. But even think about that. So I know when I was pregnant, my body went through a big change. And
I wouldn't know, like, but I trust you.
Right? And it's like, it was one of those things where I would oftentimes forget where my body was in space, right? Like I tried to squeeze through like chairs and a symposium, and just to think about how we continually have to update this information in our brains for this. It's such a complex system. I could marvel at it all day.
Yeah, the one thing that I'm thinking about is that what makes sense to me, what really makes sense to me is that split second when, I would lean back in a chair and like here, it's fine. Everything is balanced. Everything is working well. And then you have literally that split second, that millisecond that you lean back too far and everything goes haywire. And yes. You're like, I cannot keep this balance anymore. And there's like it feels like everything is moving at super speed to try to get this balance back. And yes. You can't. And so all that stuff involved in just keeping balance is amazing.
It really is amazing. I guess one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is how do we, can we train balance? And what implications does that have for behavior? And then also for the brain. So one of the really cool things in the last 2 decades of neuroscience research is suggesting that learning new movement patterns and practicing them a lot can change the brain and the structures of the brain. And that's wild, right?
I mean, growing up, we were told that by age 7, you're done. I mean, there's nothing you can do for your brain. The nuns were very clear on that. So yeah, this whole sense of, I think, plasticity that the brain can continue to change is just all new to me.
Yes, and that movement and practicing movement might be one of the most robust ways to actually change the brain. And so we knew that there was neuroscience studies that had studied this, and usually it was non-autistic college students and adults. And we wanted to see, well, what happens in autistic individuals, thinking that like it might be a good thing, especially could we avoid that plateau, that early plateau? And could that have cascading benefits later in life? But also thinking we had found previous data that core autism symptoms were highly related to balance features. Mm-hmm. Which was always very interesting. It was like, why is that? And we were able to look a little bit more into it. And that led us to this area of the brain, which I won't get too much into, but I am totally geeking out over. And it's the brain stem. It's this very early developing area of the brain. Some might even refer to it as kind of our lizard brain, like where fight and flight and attention is grabbed, but a lot of balance processing is involved in the brainstem too. And that's an area that we thought, well, could balance training actually target this area of the brain and change it? And could that have cascading effects? And so we did a pre-study where we just had it was autistic children and adolescents who were engaged in 6 weeks of our video game balance training. So we tried to make it fun, right? Like I don't like exercise. I need something a little extra to just get me there. Even though I'm fascinated by movement, I'm not always so fascinated by my own repetitive movement.
I like to watch other people move, but not so much.
Is that bad? Exercise, like when it gets hard is when I'm kind of like, I need something more. So we tried to make it fun and try to gamify it because it was really intensive balance training. So standing on one foot up to 4 minutes at a time, switching to the other foot up to 4 minutes at a time, and basically doing this over and over again in different yoga and Tai Chi poses for over an hour. And people did this for 6 weeks, came to the lab 3 times a week to do this. And we knew it had to be intensive. And so I put myself through the training first because I never would ask anybody to do something that I myself wouldn't be willing to do. And I felt like, whew, I was balancing. But it was funny when we wrote the grant, somebody came to us and was like, well, we don't even know if balance can be improved in autism. And that always I was like, bring it. Right? You know, like when somebody tells me that I or somebody who I care about can't do something, it sets something off. So I was like, well, we are going to write a paper on this and we'll see what, it's an empirical question, but we'll see what we find. Mm-hmm. And so really excitingly, we found that not only did the individuals in our study improve their balance, but they did so at the same rate as their non-autistic peers.
So what I'm hearing is that overall the body is primed, probably to a certain age or whatever, to continually improve, to adjust and readjust, and it works as this whole system that we can help train it to be, in this case, better balanced, better aware, better whatever you're looking for. Is we get to change, is we're not unchangeable.
Exactly. And, you know, in many ways, the younger we are, the more we can take advantage of that. But this really does seem to be something that is accessible to us across the lifespan. And it makes sense. Like, think about how resilient and adaptable human beings are, right?
In all sorts of climates across the world. It's still humans, and yet just the temperature and the weather is so different everywhere, but we exist.
Yes. And it's remarkable. And in part, it's because we are able to learn new tasks and adapt, you know? So think about like, oh, okay, so some aspects of movement are no longer available to me. I can use these, you know, this other part of my body to do that. And then our brain rewires to allow for that. And how amazing is that?
And that is, I mean, that's the human condition. And so learning that we can adapt, and that, you know, no loss of this or this change, it's not the end of the world. Is we are fascinating things that will continue to adapt and change.
Yes. And that I feel like, you know, just like nature requires diversity and how we approach these things, our movement requires diversity, and who we are as human beings, we need that diversity. And so I really hope that nobody comes away with this thinking like, oh, motor skills are bad in autism. No, that is absolutely not what we're saying, right? It's quite the opposite.
Right.
It's the fact that we all have differences in this, and there might be times when these differences impact something, and there might be times when it doesn't. And how do we navigate and appreciate and celebrate those differences as well?
So do you have any like outcome of the research that you've been doing that's like was super meaningful to you, where you're just like, oh yes, we found this out, or we disproved this, or we proved this, or anything that you would describe as your most meaningful outcome? And you've already talked about a number of things, so it would not surprise me if there wasn't any that stood out, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think and this might get to one of your future questions, but what keeps me coming back as a researcher is this ability to imagine and to ask questions and constantly be surprised. So I will say we don't have these findings published yet. They're under review, so knock on wood, but we're really excited because we've been looking not only at the motor system, but thinking about the sensory system and how it relates to the brain, which is a big question, right? So we know from autistic individuals who are oftentimes saying we experience this world very differently. And I mean, I hope that everybody believes that, right? When somebody says that, you believe it, just without asking for data. But I think what our brain data is showing is that particularly in this brainstem region, it's highly associated with differing degrees of sensory sensitivity. And it's only that way in the group with autism. And so trying to think about, right, like we have, it's a very early developing, some might even say like a primal brain region that tells us like fight, flight, freeze, and, like grab your attention here, do
if
here.
It's overestimating the danger, then we're fleeing from stuff that doesn't need to be fled from. And if it's underestimating, then we're putting ourselves in danger. And so that the regulation of, am I in danger? Am I not? Is this a threat? Is this a not? Is going to be dependent on how we are interpreting what is happening around us, is what our senses are picking up. There has to be some place that is trying to compile all that to make those decisions about whether I'm in danger or not.
Yes. And there's systems that tell us like that can almost like braking systems sometimes, right? In the frontal lobe that are like, woo, like, woo, flare up, put on the brakes. Right? And I think what we're finding is that is some of that, we know it goes particularly into the amygdala, which is this other brain region that's, early developing and big emotions and things. But there's even this more basic earlier piece of it that, what information gets in, what information doesn't. And some of us maybe can take that and dampen it. It's hard to do it really. I think like people who've meditated a really long time say that, they can control their heart rate and things like that, like some of these involuntary things, like awesome.
Right.
But for, most of us mere mortals, right? Like we may not be able to control that. And so this notion too, that an individual, like it made me really think a lot about interventions and how much do we put on a person to ask them to control these things, when brain wise, I look at that and I don't think, I can't think of a mechanism by which to cognitively dampen those things or control. And so I guess for me, it just further emphasized, wow, this, the experience of the world is very different. And of course, when you experience it differently, you're going to move in it differently.
Yes.
And so thinking about those pieces of it. And so anyway, that's all to say that like, I feel like the joy of this job is that like every 3 months, like my brain is just like, oh my gosh, I feel like I see it differently or from another perspective. But yeah.
Let's take you out of the lab now. What do you like to do outside of the lab? What makes Brittany then tick outside of studying motor function?
Yeah, this was a little bit of an intimidating question too, because
I'm an
like, you know,
intimidating sort of
being
person. I mean, that's what I
I
think
know.
about when people see me. They're like, "Ooh, intimidating." So yeah,
I know. No, it wasn't you. Just the fact that like being a mom of young children during a pandemic, one of the things that has really gone down is I feel like the things I used to do for fun. And so it was, you know, it made me rethink about like, what are the things that I do for self-care and for fun with this? And I mean, the very first thing is play with my kids. Like they are wild and wonderful. And I feel like this COVID experience has allowed me to get to know them better than I ever had previously, and really just spend that time, which is special. We like to go, I say I and my husband love to go on walks and walk pretty much everywhere. My children come along and they usually complain first 15 minutes until I think they're a little out of breath, and then they have to
you just got to walk them faster. They won't complain if they can't breathe. They just.
I will say we have started implementing different playgrounds we go on our walks and like that we pass. So there's a little bit of, you know, reward in that. But yeah, just getting to spend time with my family and friends. And part of what I love about being at the University of Wisconsin is there's so many amazing people, and meeting them and getting to, yeah, just share passions across different disciplines, different perspectives is pretty awesome. So that's how I spend my time.
Are you a native Wisconsinite?
I am not. I'm a Coloradan.
Oh, wow. That's a little bit of a change. Got a little bit higher ski slopes out there.
Indeed. I will say so. Both my husband and I are from Colorado. And we sometimes describe Wisconsin to people in Colorado. It's like, oh, it's very similar to Colorado, except just where the mountains are, imagine there's lakes. And,
Great.
and people are like, oh, okay.
Well, I do know that we have some people that have joined us for the conversation, so I do want to give them I don't want to totally monopolize, although I enjoy totally monopolizing. But if there are any questions, you can either put them in the chat. You can feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. You do not have to turn your camera on if you don't want to. But any questions that you might have for Brittany about either her research, about taking walks and bribing your children with playgrounds, Colorado, yeah, anything we've talked about. If you have any questions, please feel free. Put them in the chat or do the raise hand, and I can, you know, just unmute actually forget the raise hand, just unmute yourself and I'll see that you unmuted, and you'll be able to ask the question. You know, but now I'm interested in how many kids you have.
2.
Yeah. Both under 5?
Well, one is 8 and
Okay.
then one is 3. So there's always a little bit of that like span as well.
Oh, wow.
It's so fun, but it's never a dull moment.
Yeah. Oh, that's fantastic.
It is.
Okay. Any final words that you would like to say? Because I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you so much. And I also want to, you know, this goes for you, Tim, and really anybody. Our lab is very much centered in collaboration. We are, you know, not wanting to create any interventions or do things without people who, you know, from the community, and this is the autistic community and beyond, who really should have a say in all research. That's my personal opinion. But that's our vantage point, in that we want that collaboration. So if people have thoughts on different things that they personally would like to know and think that maybe we could be studying, or if they, you know, I just am always happy to talk with folks and get that perspective. So
great.
Putting that out there.
I know that, you know, as with all researchers, there is a page. at the Wasteman Center. If people want to learn a little bit more about you and contact and have any questions, that they can always
Yes,
follow up that way as well.
that's true. But please
Our
don't
out-of-date
judge
list.
me based.
Right. Yeah, please don't. Ugh.
Our webpage, my webpage is so out of date, and we're working on a whole overhaul. But yeah, you can find my contact information
That's a
there.
good thing. Is as long as there's contact information there, that's all I really care about. That's what I need. So thank you so much, Brittany, Dr. Travers. I really appreciate your time today and your insight, the work that you do, the inclusion that you have with the autistic community and the families that you bring in to try to help them figure out how they can have their best life. And I think that's really cool. So thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Tim.
Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, you too. And thanks, Amanda.
Thanks for being here.